Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us today. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this workshop, UNFCCC Dubai COP28 Climate Summit. It's sponsored by the Rob and Milani Walton Sustainability Solutions Service. And I'm excited to introduce the two speakers today. My name is Tanner Glenn. I'm an associate at Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, and I'll be moderating today's workshop. So our first speaker is Felix Dodds. He's Director of Multilateral Affairs at the Rob and Milani Walton Sustainability Solutions Service at Arizona State University, and he's an adjunct professor at the Water Institute at UNC Chapel Hill. He was the co-director of the 2014 and 2018 Nexus Conference on Water, Food, Energy, and Climate. He has co-written, which include negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, climate and energy insecurity, and the water, food, and energy climate nexus. In 2018, he was a candidate to head UNEP. Felix was the executive director of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future from 1992 to 2012. And in 2011, he chaired the UN DPI 64th NGO Conference, Sustainable Societies, Responsive Citizens, which put forward the first set of Sustainable Development Goals. And our next speaker is Jamie Cummings. She's a youth climate activist partnering with Youngo as a communications specialist and assistant of the Global Coordination Team, climate change contact point for the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction Sendai stakeholder engagement mechanism. She's a vulnerability research with the Re-Energized Disaster Risk Reduction Project at the Water Institute at her alma mater, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she has attended COP27 in Sharm, the UNFCCC Intersectional SB 58 in Bonn, and the UNGA Climate Ambition Summit in New York City. So it's our pleasure to welcome our two speakers today. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Felix to kick us off. Thank you.
I think it's Jamie who's going to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tanner, for the kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. We are getting really close to the COP, so it's exciting, especially if you're a first timer. And that's what this presentation is really for those hoping and planning to participate in the UNFCCC COP28 in Dubai this November and December, and also for those of you who are just looking for a refresher. So let's talk about what we are going to cover. Of course, we will review a bit of history on climate change and particularly climate change negotiations. We'll discuss how the UNFCCC prepares for such convenings. We will review COP27 outcomes and legacies that will kind of set the stage for what folks are expecting out of COP28. We'll review the UNFCCC bond preparatory sessions where the agenda was set, or not really, for COP28. We will discuss negotiating groups and key people to know in the space, then talk about priorities at COP28 and also what the breakdown of the venue looks like and how to get engaged. We'll talk about why even attend a COP and give some examples of stakeholder engagement from the Youngo side of things, which is the stakeholder group I'm a part of, and also an example from Felix's work. We'll discuss the main issues at COP28, what to look out for, and what's going to be kind of the hot topics. We'll go beyond the negotiations and discuss ways to engage outside of the negotiations happening in Dubai. And of course, we'll share resources, and we'll share this presentation at the end with all the links and information, and review some dates moving into 2024 that will be important to continue engaging in the climate space. So yeah, that's what we're going over. So let's get into it. The first is going to be the history of climate change, and especially climate change negotiations. So there are a few critical meetings and dates that are important to keep in mind and understand how we got to where we are today. Some of those, the first important ones come in 1979 and 1990. These are climate conferences that lead to the creation of the IPCC, which is an intersectional panel that group of scientists and who report on climate change and the state of play of the climate. And it also, the meeting in 1990 led to the establishment of the UNFCCC, which for those of you who aren't familiar, that's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And they're the UN entity that is in charge of COPs and the climate space. So then we moved to the Earth Summit in 1992, when the UNFCCC is finally signed into being. 165 countries originally signed the organization into existence, and currently there are 199 parties involved in the UNFCCC. This finally came into force 2 years later in 1994, after there were ratifications from national parliaments, and all of this ratification happened on the back end. The Earth Summit is also where we saw the establishment of stakeholder groups, and we will talk a bit more about that. And fun fact, Felix was actually a part of that very special summit. So he is such an expert and goes all the way back to the inception of this process. So then we move into Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. This is an outcome which sets binding emission reduction targets for the first time. We see that 55 countries join in the Kyoto Protocol, which cover 55% of world emissions. So it's not comprehensive. And this was the time when we finally set the stage for countries committing to reviewing their emissions profiles and greenhouse gas emissions. So the first review period took place from 2008 to 2012. And then in 2012, we have the Doha Amendment, which establishes a second commitment period from 2013 to 2020. Then we move into Copenhagen, a climate accord, which is a non-binding agreement. This establishes the financial mechanisms to address climate change. We see a commitment of $100 billion from country parties. We also established the Green Climate Fund, and all countries now agree to report. All parties to the UNFCCC agree to report on their emissions. Unfortunately, we still have not seen the fulfillment of the $100 billion fund by 2020. However, this is when it was initially established as a target. And then, of course, many of you are familiar with the Paris COP in 2015. This is where, again, we see a renewed commitment to the 100 billion, and that key number, 1.5 degrees, a commitment to keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees warming Celsius. And yeah, that is where we get the global stocktake process, which is reviewing these commitments every 5 years. That's going to be a big topic at this year's COP, and we will discuss that coming up. So yeah, that's a bit of the history of the process, and I'll pass it to Felix to talk more about the intersessional process as well.
So it's very kind of you to say I was there in 1992, and I was, but I was also there in 1990 at the Second World Climate Conference, where we saw the establishment of the process which had to go to UN General Assembly for the UNFCCC. And I think we had all originally hoped there would be targets in the agreement in 1992, and there weren't. And so we perhaps failed to recognize with enough governments the urgency. I think they felt they had a lot more time than they turned out to do. And I heard just before I came on that, in fact, the expectation is we will reach the 100 billion this year. And so that's 3 years later than we had expected to do it. So let's see if that's true, and then look into actually what is that? Is it grants, loans, or what is it? Because that's an important part of it. So I'm going to start to take you through how the UNFCCC prepares. And so maybe a kind of just a looking out a little, you know, with some criticism of the decision for the United Arab Emirates to host this particular COP because they are a member of OPEC. But then again, we've had a number of COPs hosted by Poland, which is a major exporter of coal. The UK is an exporter of oil. But the way that the decision process goes is that the unless a country offers to host, then it actually happens in theory in Bonn in Germany, because that's where the UNFCCC has its secretariat. But the expectation is that countries will offer in a rotational manner through the 5 different UN regions. And so we had Africa was Egypt. That's why we had Egypt last. The Western European and other groups was the UK. That's why it was the previous one. And I think I have this in the wrong order. So Latin America and Caribbean is actually after Eastern Europe. And so Eastern Europe is where it's expected to happen next time. And then this year is Asia. And so the Asian countries chose the United Arab Emirates. So there's a logic to which region it is at any particular time, and then it's up to that region to propose a candidate for the presidency of the COP. We're still in the Egyptian presidency until we arrive and the COP28 starts. So it's important to remember that the work continues after the COP by that particular presidency. There's also there's a conference of the parties. We kind of have 3. I mean, though Kyoto is kind of finished, we have the Conference of the Parties for the Framework Convention. We have the Conference of the Parties for the Paris Agreement. And so they will each have a bureau, which will help manage the process through the year. And that bureau is again drawn from the 5 regional groups. You'll have, in addition to that, we'll be dealing with the subsidiary bodies later, but you'll have 2 chairs for the subsidiary bodies. That's the SUBSTA and the SBI. And then you have the UN Secretariat, and the UN Secretariat is, as I say, based in Bonn, and it will do things like provide organizational support, the technical reports that need to be done, or synthesis reports that are asked based on inputs, particularly to things like the global stocktake, which we'll deal with later. They'll also make sure that the information is available, and if you're going to the COP, there are 2 websites you need to go to: the COP28 United Arab Emirates presidency website, but also the papers for everyday use in the negotiations are actually in the UNFCCC website. So you need to make sure you go there as well. And so there's a number of constituted bodies, and this is the section which is a little bit dense, but you'll have the notes that we have to each of these. But it gives you an idea of how many sub parts of the negotiations are going on, often at the same time, and therefore it's a problematic for small delegations. If you have small countries, particularly the small island developing states or the least developed countries, will have small delegations, so they won't be able to cover all of the constituted bodies. So you have the Adaptation Committee, which clearly deals with it came out of the Cancun 2010 COP just after Copenhagen, and it deals with enhancing action on adaptation in the context of implementing the already agreed language. You have the Adaptation Fund Board, and that supervises and manages the Adaptation Fund. There are 3 potential funds. You've got the Green Climate Fund, you've got the Adaptation Fund, and then soon to be established, we hope, at COP28, the Loss and Damage Fund. And each of those will have a form of structure around it to make sure that it functions properly. We don't know exactly what the Green Climate Fund will look like, not Green Climate Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund yet. We also have the advisory board of the Climate Technology Center and Network, and this is the operational arm of the technology mechanism, and it stimulates technology cooperation. Since Rio, there's been a real interest in hoping to make it possible for developing countries not to go down the same developed path that we did, which caused a lot of the problems from the as far as carbon dioxide emissions, but also in other areas. So the transfer of technology is really important, and that helps with that. You have Article 6.4 supervisory body, and my understanding is today they've actually agreed the methodological framework after 2 years of, well, more than 2 years of work on that. So that's a real advancement as we go into the COP itself. You've got the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, as executive board, and that supervised what is now kind of really not, I mean, we've finished the Kyoto Protocol, but there's still some elements of that continues that will have to be wrapped up. You have the Compliance Committee of Kyoto, again, part of letting that process end and hopefully close down those particular committees. You have the consultative group of experts, which supports developing countries to fulfill their reporting requirements, and also supports the implementation of the enhanced transparency framework under Article 13. So that's the first set of constituted bodies. There are more to come. And so as we move on to the next slide, the executive committee of the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage will play an important role as we move forward, because that was where the loss and damage process started from. And it kind of has gone on from, I think, 2006 onwards, the discussion, but it didn't become an item on the agenda until Sharm. The Joint Implementation Supervisory Committee, which deals with the guidance for the CMP and supervises the verification process for specific projects to confirm reduction. So that's part of what we were talking about before. And then you've got, wait a second, I've just got to, got it, okay. Then we've got the Standing Committee on Finance, which looks at rationalizing the financial mechanisms, mobilization of financial resources, reporting and verification for developing countries. The Technology Executive Committee, it's a bit more around the transfer of low emission and climate resistance technologies. The Paris Agreement for the implementation of the Compliance Committee, and so that's to see whether or not we're actually moving forward on the delivery. And then you've got the Transitional Committee, which we'll deal with on loss and damage later. So let's move to the next one. So this is produced by the Ringo Group, the research non-government organizations, one of the constituencies, and it tries to put under what the two subsidiary bodies of the COP, and it gives you an idea of all the things I've just discussed, where they fit into the whole system. So I hope, I'm not going to go through that because we've gone through the individuals, but you see the two subsidiary bodies, the one on science, technology, technological advice, and the subsidiary body on implementation. There are other negotiations going under, those on gender or on agriculture, but these are the kind of formal bodies. I saw someone put a hand up, and you may have joined afterwards. We're going to stop halfway through, and if you want to do a question, we're not going to bring people in. You just put the question in the Q&A if you can, and then we're going to halfway through we'll have a look at which ones we can answer. And as Tanner said at the beginning, we will answer those that we can't after the meeting, and the UNFCCC has offered to help if we can't answer some of the questions. So don't put your hands up because we won't be calling you. Okay. What are the types of meetings that you have at the COP, or to be honest, at the preparatory meeting in Bonn? And so you have plenaries, which is open to everyone, and often they will be for the different bodies, the COP, the CMP, or the CMA, so the Kyoto plenary, or the Paris plenary, or the Framework Convention itself. Contact group usually has 2 facilitators, and it's open to observers unless a third object. Informal meetings have 2 facilitators. So they will have a facilitator from developed and developing countries. If established by the contact groups, they're closed, but they are recommended to be open. And at least the first and last meetings of the informals are, I mean, at least in the agriculture section where I go, are open, and they report on what they're going to do at the beginning, and then they report on how far they've got at the end. There are informal drafting groups which are not open to observers unless you happen to be on a government delegation, which a number of NGOs in different countries are. They have mandated events like the Ocean Dialogues, and bilateral meetings happen all the time. And so if you're following a particular issue, and I've been following the agriculture negotiations, then you'll find that when there's a disagreement between, say, G77 and the EU, they might have just a bilateral between the two, or the US and G77, or particular countries who are finding it difficult to move the process forward. But that also applies to something you guys can do as well. I mean, so if you build at the Bonn meeting your relationship with the key government officials, then you are able then to have your own meetings to try and persuade them to move forward. I would say that where we are at the moment, the kind of meetings that, if you are going in to try and influence any of the text, then it's perhaps easiest to choose what we call countries, single decision countries. So if you're going to talk to the EU, you've got to persuade all of the EU countries. If it's got to go to G77, it's got to go into G77 coordination. But if you look at the single decision countries, then you're able to potentially get stuff in quite late into the negotiations. So the United States, Mexico, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, those kinds of countries are single decision countries, and you can work on getting some of what you want through them. That would be my advice as we go into the COP. If you're going to go to the subsidiary body meetings earlier in the year, then you approach all governments. Okay, Jamie, you're taking over.
Great. So as discussed, we want to review some of the key outcomes from COP27, which took place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt this past November. So one of the main ones was the decision to establish a loss and damage fund. Of course, the fund was not established at 27, but there was a decision to establish a fund, and those negotiations are ongoing. We'll touch on them in a bit. Additionally, we saw the mitigation work program in Sharm el-Sheikh and a master plan that really accelerated decarbonization and mitigation efforts, particularly in power, road transport, steel, hydrogen, and the agricultural sectors. There was also Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda dealing with how to adapt to a changing climate. And this one's not listed, but as was mentioned, I work closely with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Secretary General announced last year the early warnings for all initiative, which is supposed to provide early warnings universally by 2027. So that was a great outcome. We also saw the Action on Water Adaptation and Resilience Initiative, or AWARE, insurance adaptation acceleration, an African carbon market initiative. There's a lot of outcomes that are still being worked upon in the carbon market sector. And that's something that we're looking to see coming out of hopefully COP28. Additionally, a global renewables alliance and a first movers coalition on cement and concrete commitments as ways to build more sustainable areas and absorb some of these emissions. So those are some of the key outcomes. And then we also have some shortcomings as well. So next slide. So things that weren't achieved. As mentioned, there's still not been enough fulfillment of the 100 billion, which goes far back in the negotiations. And there is also a real push to increase this ambition above 100 billion, despite the fact that the original amount is not fulfilled yet. So there haven't been enough new nationally determined contributions. We also saw a small advancement on climate mitigation, but it wasn't enough. So this outcome still fails to mention oil and gas, only refers to coal as fossil fuels, and there is not a lot of movement towards a phase out, but only the words phase down of fossil fuels. We also saw that there was half the number of companies are setting net zero targets. Obviously, the private sector has a huge impact on emissions and plans to reduce those emissions. So that's something that they're looking to build upon as well. And as mentioned, we did not establish new rules for the global carbon market as a way to trade credits for such a market in a way to reduce emissions through a market economy. Yeah, that's what I'll say for now. Go to the next slide.
I think this is back to me. So just going into how it works. Yeah, clearly organizations that are on this, I'm guessing, are already accredited. And if you're not, there's a process on the UNFCCC site which explains the way to do it. It usually takes a year, and my memory is that you have to have submitted your accreditation details by the end of June, I think, or something like that. So if you haven't accredited, you may be coming through another organization and you want to do that. Private companies can't accredit. It has to be a non-government organization. So you have a lot of industry coming in through either being on government delegations or the International Chamber of Commerce or one of the sector industry NGOs, which are seen as NGOs. In fact, I think the ICC was the first or second non-government organization that was ever accredited to the UN after it was established. So the UNFCCC, as I said, meets annually. It usually has one or two preparatory meetings. The only time I remember it having two was in the run-up to Copenhagen. But the important thing, if you want to influence these processes, is to be able to be attending the preparatory meeting in Bonn when governments are, in a sense, first and most open and have less hassles going on, because the further you get into the negotiations, the less time they probably have to talk to non-government organizations or constituency bodies. And so my recommendation is that if you want to in future engage in the next COP, then you have to think about attending the Bonn Climate Conference in June. There'll be other subsidiary meetings that will happen between the either before the Bonn meeting or after the Bonn meeting, and often Jamie will go into this in details, the constituency bodies that exist, there are 9, are invited to send people to those meetings, and so you need to sign up to the constituency body that's most relevant to you. I think one of the things that we saw at the Bonn meeting this last year was that there were just a humongous amount of items on the agenda, and there is a big conversation going on how we could reduce that. The SBI chairs, or the SB chairs, highlighted that they had to fit 70 30-hour slots into the schedule schedule of the meeting, with which is 10 days, so that we need to kind of think about how this can be streamlined post this meeting, because at the moment it's problematic. There are other meetings that have happened since then. The Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit, the G7, the G20. But of course, we're all now leading up to the meeting in November, later, 2.5 weeks away. So the two subsidiary bodies, they meet twice. They meet once at the Bonn meeting, and then they will continue their negotiations at the COP, and these are where particular things will be moved forward. So we're at the moment, we're in agriculture, where I've been doing some stuff. It's a bit of a mess, to say the least, but they've been already told how many days they will have available for their meetings, and so I think there will be some form of what shall we say, streamlining on what can happen. And if you're the presidency, and remember, we're still under the Egyptian presidency until we get to Dubai. The incoming presidency will be looking at all of the different negotiations that are going on and seeing what can be moved forward and what can't. And my guess is what they'll do is they'll ring fence ones that they don't think can move forward, and they'll be telling the negotiators that they need to, in a sense, limit what they can achieve there. And then they'll focus on things like the loss and damage and the global stock take, which are the two major issues. And so you have these two subsidiary bodies. I'm not going to go over the different aspects of them, but you can, if it's the first time, you can go and look at all the papers from the Bonn meeting are available, or any specific meetings that have happened since. But they deal with things that at least Jamie and I are interested in, like vulnerability, adaptation to climate change. And so from our side, you know, we're engaged in different parts of the agenda where we can raise those particular issues. So the 1992 Rio Declaration, which is 27 principles on basically guiding governments to move towards a more sustainable planet. It includes the polluter pays principle, the principle of prior informed consent. But for the climate negotiations, and to be honest, for most negotiations, it includes the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which basically indicates that, you know, the people who can do things should do things. So developed countries need to acknowledge their responsibility they bear for the international pursuit of sustainable development in view of the pressures their societies place on the global environment and of the technologies and financial resources that they have. States have common but differentiated responsibility. Now, this is a controversial issue within some of the developed countries. The US does not like that this principle was agreed in 92, and it's impacted a lot on the negotiations. That's why we had the Kyoto Protocol, which dealt with that developed countries needed to take their historical responsibility, and developing countries, you know, should benefit from recognizing that they should be allowed to develop, and that the developing countries should help pay for that change to a more sustainable way. So two agenda items came out that are, I mean, it applies across all of the negotiations, but two agenda items came out with the like-minded group was pushing it. And this is China, this is Cuba, who are chair of G77, it's Egypt, it's Bangladesh, it's Bolivia, it's Sri Lanka, it's Sudan, it's Venezuela, it's Vietnam, and many others. And they were looking at the urgent scaling up of financial support for developed countries parties in line with Article 4, Paragraph 5 of the Paris Agreement, to enable implementation for developing countries. common but differentiated responsibility. And the operationalization of that is part of the discussion which will go on at the COP. And so that will play into particularly the discussion on the loss and damage issue. You know, should that, who is putting into the fund? Is it public money? Is it private money? What is it? We'll also go into the discussion on what the new quantitative goal that will take the place of the 100 billion will be. Jamie, I think it's you.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So just touching a little more on the loss and damage outcome. So from COP27, they established a transitional committee that would be in charge of working to produce a set of recommendations on how to establish the fund. So something that developing countries are really calling for is the operationalization of the fund at COP28. Some are skeptical that this will happen, especially if you look at a reference like the Green Climate Fund, which took 5 years to operationalize. And so we've got some work to do. The transitional committee is headed by South Africa and Finland, and there are, well, I'll get into this in the next slide, who the member states are. There's 24. But this was really a big win, the establishment of a decision to create a fund from civil society. This was a big push, especially from, as Felix was mentioning, like the climate justice space. And so to see the actual operationalization will be the true win. Okay, next slide. So discussing the makeup a little bit more, as I said, there are 24 members who are parties to the convention. 10 members come from developed countries and 14 members come from developing countries. So you can kind of see the division there. There are, in this presentation, there's a list of all of the delegated negotiators who are a part to this. So you can take a look at that once we send it out. But just to note that from the developing countries, there are members from Asia and the Pacific. There are members from Latin America and the Caribbean, from Africa, as well as small island developing states, or the SIDS, which was a new kind of addition in the division here, as small island developing states are often some of the regions who are facing the most overt and intense outcomes of loss and damages now. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So another thing that I want to touch on is just this Paris rule book or roadmap that came out of Paris that discusses kind of where we are in reviewing these targets and where we're going. So as you see, we're in 2023. This will be the first global stock take of where we are on parties' nationally determined contributions. And then we'll have the next global stock take is set to take place in 2028 after the new NDCs come out 2025. And then, of course, the ultimate goal, which unfortunately we are very far away from in 2050, is net zero emissions and a climate resilient world. So fingers crossed that we get there. We've got a lot of work to do, but that's kind of an outline that was set out in Paris. Okay. Felix, back to you.
Thanks. So one of the other, I mean, the main issue that we're dealing with is things relating to the global stock take. The two co-chairs, again, are South African. I would just go back to the transitional committee. Richard Sherman, who is one of the co-chairs, in the 2000s was an NGO. So you've seen a number of people who were active in the NGO movement in the period of 2000 to 2012 have now ended up as negotiators for the government. So maybe there's some hope. The Minister of Environment for Forestries and Fisheries is the South African Minister, Barbara Creasy, and Dan Jorgensen from Denmark, who's the Minister of Development Cooperation and Global Climate Policy. They're trying to put together, in a sense, the elements of what could come out as a decision on the global stock take. And so there's been a process on this. So again, it's kind of late if you're going to try and engage in this global stock take. You might want to think about starting that process after now. There have been some interesting initiatives by local and subnational government to do their own global stock take. So I think that's really good. What we've seen is an information period up to June 2023, and also before that, a technical assessment of where we were and how we were going to measure the global stock take up till first SB 56, and then it's been an ongoing process up to June this year. And then what is the outcome? So the two ministers have been asked to kind of look at how we address that. And so that's not been easy. There were 65 page synthesis report published by the Secretariat on how to move forward on the global stock take to build a tangible roadmap to 2030. So the question, the disagreement is around, do we look backwards? Collecting, looking, processing at gaps, challenges, or barriers, or do we look forward at opportunities, messages for the future? So there's a kind of different approach to that, and they haven't yet got to how they're going to approach that. And I would just say again, if you've got your hands up, please take them down, because we're not going to call people who've got their hands up. We will stop halfway through for questions, and then questions at the end. So if we move on, so just to show you again, you've got this to look at, how the process matured over the years. You had the inputs, the country reports and submissions, the IPCC reports, submissions from countries and stakeholders. So if you're going to engage in the next review, then there's an opportunity for you to do that, and you can go and look at previous submissions to get an idea of how they're doing it. We've then seen that there's a kind of process where the UNFCCC brings it in, and I talked about the synthesis and compiling inputs, and then the output, which was what they've kind of just done on the information, and how then you put it into a final thing which can be then assessed and kind of give direction to not just the next global stock take, but maybe we can have some impact on the national determined contributions. So the arguments, or some of the arguments, just to be a little bit more clear on this, do we look back and just assess the problems, which clearly the initial assessment is not good, or do we recognize that there's been a lot of new things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years which are going to have a bigger impact on the future, and what can we do to accelerate those? I'm guessing in the end it'll be a combination of both. There'll have to be some backward looking, but on the way forward it also then will come into things like technological transfer, capacity building, funding, all the traditional, what we call MOIs, means of implementation. Yeah, so I was going to just kind of go through a little bit about some of the key people as well who are involved in this. So as I said, we're still in the Egyptian presidency, and the high-level champion Mahmoud Mohidin is still addressing the priorities that the Egyptians had set for the high-level champion. So these are more for the voluntary commitments, the opportunity to launch coalitions of the willing space, to move the issues, because in the negotiations they don't have necessarily a space which fits exactly. So these are really important to particularly future global stock takes, because they are the engine to move the process forward, so you don't just rely on the formal process. And so the key elements of that were addressing the adaptation gap, increasing finance for climate action, accelerating action, normally, and building credibility and trust. And so you can quite well suggest that they did succeed in doing increasing finance for climate action, because the loss and damage fund, which personally I did not think was going to happen at Sharm, I think many people were not optimistic going into that meeting. It did actually happen. So the Egyptians deserve a lot of credit, and particularly the Pakistan chair of G77 at the time, their lead negotiator Farouk Khan, I think, for actually getting an agreement. I think a lot of the contradictions in that agreement are now playing out, but hopefully they will be answered by Jamie when she comes on. So just looking to the new high-level champion. So Rizan is former WWF. She's the president of IUCN. She headed the United Arab Emirates environmental agency, so has done a lot to kind of move environmental issues both in the NGO world but also in her own country, and she and her team have set a number of key things that they're going to do, and there will, out of some of those, there will be declarations. So so you'll see maybe on agriculture and other things, something coming from that. So she's looking at the just finance, she's looking at loss and damage, she's looking at adaptation and resilience, she's looking at nature, she's looking at a just energy transition. So again, what are the elements to accelerate that? And she'll stay in this position until November next year, and her team, or a large number of the team, will be trying to make sure that that those commitments that are made have some type of accountability mechanism. There is one accountability mechanism in the space of the high-level champion for those who are making commitments. Jamie, it's over to you.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about negotiating groups. So these are groups that are typically aligned when it comes to the negotiations. They decide things many times together. And as Felix mentioned, if you want to sway one country, you kind of need to sway the whole block to make a decision. So next slide. Just to review a few of these, the largest is Group 77 or G77, as many call it. G77 in China. Oftentimes also will work in tandem. Currently, the chair is Cuba. Another large group, of course, is the European Union. The current president is Sweden. The Africa group, which has a chair of Zambia. The Arab States group, the chair currently is Sudan. There's also groups that are more based on not region, but perhaps interest. So the Environmental Integrity Group, who's currently chaired by Switzerland. So this was formed in 2000. It's comprised of Mexico, Liechtenstein, Monaco, Republic of Korea, Switzerland, and Georgia. We also have the least developed countries, whose current chair is Senegal, or LDCs, and the Alliance of Small Island States, current chair is Antigua and Barbuda, and they're also referred to as AOSIS often, and include the SIDS, or Small Island Developing States. Okay, a few more to review. The Umbrella Group, this is a coalition of parties that was formed following the Kyoto Protocol. The states that make up this group are Australia, Canada, Iceland, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Kazakhstan, Norway, Ukraine, and the United States. We also have the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, as many people know them. Their current president is Equatorial Guinea. And the current chair is Chile. Then we have the BASIC group. This BASIC stands for Brazil, South Africa, China, and India. The current chair is India. The BRICS group as well. The like-minded group, we see this is Algeria, Bangladesh, Bolivia, China, Cuba, Ecuador, Egypt, El Salvador, India, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Malaysia, Mali, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Vietnam. quite the list. Then we have the Coalition of Rainforest Nations. So these are nations that, of course, have a tie specifically to rainforest and an interest perhaps in protecting them. The current chair is Papua New Guinea. We have the Bolivarian Alliance for Peoples of America, or ALBA in Spanish, if you would change the order to how you say it in Spanish. And then we have the Most Vulnerable Forum, which is particularly interesting, as Felix mentioned to him and I, as we do some vulnerability research, and their current chair is Ghana. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So this is a helpful overview that kind of gives a block, shows you some of the negotiating blocks and especially where they overlay with each other. So where certain countries, are playing in multiple blocks and multiple spaces. This is a graphic, I believe it's from Ringo, so thanks for letting us use that. It does need a little bit of updating. As you can see, in the European Union, we still have the United Kingdom. Maybe they'll rejoin, and we don't have to change that block after all this mess that they've made, but we'll see. So yeah, this is a helpful way to overview of where countries are typically going to align themselves compared to who their negotiating groups are. Next slide.
Yeah, it's back to me. Again, I see some people put hands up. If you can put your questions in the Q&A, we're not going to do the hands thing. And as we said at the beginning, if we can't answer some of the questions because we've run out of time, we're going to send through, you'll get a link to the recording and the PowerPoint. We'll also try and answer the questions in a Word document that you'll have access to. So don't put your hand up, put your questions in the Q&A and chat to each other in the chat. We'll try and save the chat as well so that you can see other people's LinkedIn if that's what they've put. So what I just wanted to do with the next couple of slides is just give you an idea of some of the key people. And there are many key people, but some of the key people that you might say bump into and say, do you want to go for a coffee? So Razan, as you can see there, she's our high-level champion. You've got the president designate of COP28, Al Jabeera, over to the left, and he's an interesting mixture in the sense of that he's both an advocate for renewables and also clearly the minister for oil and gas. And so, but then again, wherever we're going, there'll be an equivalent of that. Brazil will have the equivalent. They're having actually the COP in Brazil close to an oil, where they're exploring for oil on the Amazon basin. You have Poland, who, twice have had the COP and are a major coal producer. And then the UK is a major oil producer as well. So it's not that easy to find countries, because you have to, if you're looking at 40 to 70,000 people coming, which is where we are at the moment, 40,000 in Sharm and 70,000 potentially in Dubai, you have very limited number of countries that can actually host such a thing. So, you're looking in Africa potentially at Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya are probably the only 4 who could host a COP. So just it's important to understand that. Simon Steele is a friend of Jamie's. He's the head of the Secretariat for the UNFCCC. They hang out a lot. Jacob Worksman is the lead negotiator for the EU. He used to be in the NGO world. He was with the Foundation for International Law and Development Field, who were the main advisors to SIDS countries in 1992 for the climate conference. So a very great lawyer based organization. I'm not sure that he was with them at them. I think he came and joined later. Franz Perez, from Switzerland. He's an ambassador, and he's played a critical role in a lot of the negotiations, whether it's been here or setting up the Plastics Convention or in biodiversity. He's been and is perhaps best well known for the work he's done in the chemicals sectors on setting up some of the amendments to the Basel Convention. Mohamed Nasser was, some of you, if you were in Egypt, would have met him. He was one of the key negotiators for the Egyptian government, and also very easy to grab for a coffee. And so here's a few other people. So I've put in the two chairs. The SPI chair is Nabil Manur, and the substitute chair is Harry Virils. Now, Nabil is from Pakistan, and Harry is from the Netherlands. You've got Senegal, as we talked about, for the LDCs, Madeleine, and you've got down to the far right, you've got Leila, who is the president. She's from Morocco, and she's the president of the United Nations Environment Assembly, which will happen in February and March next year, and will, I think, be the first time that I can think of when all the multilateral environmental agreements will be coming to a UN a UNEP meeting, whether it's the assembly or its predecessor, the governing council. So there's an attempt to bring and discuss how the UNFCCC, how the UNCCD, the Convention on Combat Desertification, the UN Biodiversity Convention, and other multilateral environmental agreements, how they can better coordinate. And there'll be a report on the setting up of the third science body, which is the one that's going to be set up on chemicals and waste. We already have the IPCC for climate. We have the IPBES for biodiversity, and this third one. And then the question will be, how will these work together? The person I left out is Hannah. Hannah's an amazing negotiator. She was involved very much with the SDG negotiations, and very approachable and supportive of non-government organizations. The position that she holds at the moment is she's the chief climate negotiator, and she's on the COP28 Transitional Committee, and she's the UAE's special envoy on climate. So she's got a lot of work that she's doing, but has played an important role in the past. So I wanted to just do a couple of slides on, this is, you're all preparing, but so are the governments. And I do a training for how to engage in the UN, and I have a whole section, and this is a smaller version of imagining if you are a government delegate. So these are the kind of things that they should be having in what would have normally been a big lever arch file. And so you should also be thinking about this. So if you're engaging in the negotiations, these are the kind of things you need to have with you. So the papers for the UN meeting, reports that have been done. So we talked about the synthesis report for the stock take. You need to have those reports and look at the previous decisions that have led to the stock taking, so you understand what we're doing before you engage in it. You need to understand the negotiating history, and for that there's a wonderful resource which is called the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. And the Earth Negotiations Bulletin is produced by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and it always does a history before you go to the copy. It'll tell you what has happened in previous meetings, the key things. So if you've not signed up to what's called their Climate L, then you should do that, because you can then post your own events there. But you should go and look. And the other great thing is that they take pictures of the delegates. And so if you go there for the last meeting in Sharm, you could see what particular delegates look like, and that makes it a lot easier to find them. What is the government's interest? What do they want to do? So that's, what do you want to do? And you need to have that. What's your top 5 that you want to do? What are the core issues for the team that you're part of. Now, that might be that you're part of like Yongo, one of the constituency bodies. In the context of the governments, they'll have what are their red lines, and they'll be trying to make sure that they're not negotiated out. But if they are being addressed in the meeting, they will potentially trade between different negotiations. So just be aware that you might be fighting a particular country's red line in one negotiation, and they're on adaptation, and they might be doing something else in the global stocktake where they do a deal. So just be aware of the whole of the negotiations if you're doing that. You need to have material including legal, this is what the governments do, technical and economic issues that are relevant to the country. They need to state the positions that you know already of previous governments. If the government's been in the negotiations, they would have collected the red lines that they've seen in previous negotiations, and where they can have an idea of where those governments are, and they will have had bilaterals with them. So you can see that it's a huge amount of work. If you're going to go into a specific negotiation, you need to know the names of the people in the other delegations. And so if they've been doing this for a number of while, which is, for example, what the case is in agriculture, they all know each other. And so they're able to then kind of do those bilaterals, plan for coordination with other governments. What is your amendments, depending on where the text is going? Now, again, this is a lot easier if you're in Bonn than you're in Dubai, because you're earlier in the situation. And what guidance is needed when do you have to consult capitals? They'll be sending back what they call a telegram, but it's now, I guess, an email with what's happened in each of the negotiations. Someone will have the job of pulling that together. So all of that will be very big for the US, but might be a lot less for Barbados, because they'll be focusing on specific things that they are focusing on, and they'll have less of a delegation to cover the whole lot. So it's important to understand what the governments are taking in their lever arch. Some of this you should be having in your lever arch. So the government's approach to speaking at a meeting. Again, the beginning is the easiest, because it's, again, when the people are saying the first things that they want in a particular negotiation. So they'll make an initial statement. It'll be a general one. They won't be pushing it forward, particularly to give a general idea of what they're doing. During the debate, as the debate moves forward through the negotiations, they'll start to hone down on the specific things that they want. And then they'll be pushing into different formal and informal. So the US advice on speaking that one of their delegates told me is, tell the governments what you're going to say. That's at the beginning. Say it. Tell them what you said, so can repeat. The first statement is very much about repeating what you're saying. Check with key delegations that matter if they have been using interpretation, that they understand your points. So that's quite important. Interpretation doesn't necessarily mean it's interpreted culturally. And so a good example would be a target tends to mean in the US and in the UK, it tends to be that you're going to do it. Doesn't mean that you do it, but you intend to do it. While kind of a more French approach would be seeing it as aspirational. So understanding whether they've understood exactly what you're doing is part of what a government would do when they're asking for that. So just a few key sites. You'll already be getting the stuff from the UNFCCC site. That's where you'll get the up-to-date information on where the negotiations are going. There'll be video links to the plenaries that you can watch. They'll have the provisional schedule up. They have a book, a kind of handbook, which deals more with the logistics than what we're going to just cover. We're covering some of the logistics, but it's well worth reading. They'll have a daily schedule, and there'll be an app where you'll get the daily schedule once you get there. Always check. They'll have screens all the way through the negotiating space, and that'll tell you if rooms have moved or if meetings have been cancelled. And then there are three basically things you should sign up to. The first being, as I said, the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, because it gives you the history and then it gives you how each of the negotiations is going. ECO is the newsletter that's produced by the Climate Action Network. It's good to see what they're saying. And then from the developing country side, the Third World Network also produces updates and briefings. So those are three, and we put links so that you can then kind of link to getting their information as you move into the meetings. So Jamie, it's over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And just wanted to highlight one thing that Felix mentioned on the CCTVs. It is very common that meeting rooms last minute will change, or kind of the negotiations are all scrambled around. So it is really important that you check those to be kind of aware of what's going on at that current time at the COP. So just to talk a little bit more about logistics, as Felix mentioned, this is a code of conduct. This was taken from the UNFCCC website, but it just discusses kind of ways to conduct oneself in the COP arena, and certain things that are expected and not really considered appropriate and could have consequences. So if you are planning to attend, definitely recommend checking that out and just having a read over to make sure that you're in line with all the code of conduct. Next slide. And then to talk a little bit about logistics and like practical information regarding the COP. We have received information that the WhatsApp calls will not work on the Dubai like local on Dubai networks. So you need a local SIM card. Sorry, on a Dubai local SIM card, they won't work. So you will need like an international plan, depending on where you're traveling from, to make sure that you can still access those WhatsApp group chats. Or the group chats will work fine, but it's the calls that is the issue. So worth looking into that if you're traveling from outside of the UAE. Also in the UAE, they use a plug G, which is like the same as a UK plug. So make sure you bring your converters. And a helpful tip from Felix is if you sit near a charging port, oftentimes everyone needs to charge their phones and their laptops, including negotiators and different delegates. So it's a good way to kind of catch someone before they go into a negotiation room. FaceTime and regular calls should work as normal on Wi-Fi, so no need to worry there. Traffic in Dubai is quite heavy. We know it's a very busy city, large city, so make sure you allocate adequate time to get to and from the venue or wherever your meeting spaces are, and also ensuring that if you can, your accommodation is near the metro, because that will get you to the expo center easily. And as I said, the metro is facilitated between COP28 and the main hotel zones. It's complimentary for Blue Zone pass holders. So if you're accredited, you should get a complimentary travel pass. They almost always do this at COPs, depending on where it's hosted. And you can also rent a car if that's an option. And Uber and Lyft are also available in Dubai on the traditional apps. Next slide. Okay, a couple other things. So the green zone, which is outside of the blue zone and doesn't require the same blue zone accreditation, is also open to those who are in the blue zone. So if you're interested in an event that's happening in the green zone, you can attend it as well. They're right next to each other. I'll show you a map in a minute, but you can kind of go back and forth, although security may take some time going in and out. I mentioned the accommodation, trying to make sure you're able to travel to and from. There is a helpful accommodation portal that's created by COP28. It has a nice map where you can compare prices and distance and kind of the ratings, star ratings of hotels. So that's nice to see, and that's linked in the presentation. Do know that posting videos online could be, this is kind of in the code of conduct, kind of considered defamatory or offensive. So just be aware of that and aware of what you are putting online. We also have the exchange rate listed. This may change a little bit, but it's pretty much standard between the Dubai or the UAE currency and the euro, as well as the US dollar. Majority of stores do accept credit cards as well as Apple Pay, so you can use those. Also, just to note that when you're traveling into a foreign country, it's good to carry a doctor's prescription for any medications you have in case they, have a question about what the medication is, and also recommend carrying that in your, not your checked bag, but your carry-on bag, so you have it just in case something happens, which fingers crossed it doesn't to the checked baggage. And then, yeah, a last note is there are business facilities at the Expo Center in Dubai. So there will be some access to computers for those that don't have. There aren't many, but it's good to know there are a lot of charging ports there as well. And they also have access to printing. So if you need to print some materials, you can get to that. Okay, next slide.
Amy, I think we can
Okay,
jump in here,
so
real quick, just with
yeah.
the Q&A portion. We're about halfway done. I know we're moving right along, so I don't want to take up too much time with questions. We have a lot of good ones in here, so we won't be able to answer all of them during the session, but we'll follow up later. The first, this is to you, Jamie. How can Youngo play a more strategic and substantial role in COP28 and the next COPs? Also in UNFCCC and beyond institutionally, so the world could see that young people globally could significantly improve their actions to secure a better future.
Yeah, thank you, Tanner. That's a great question. And I actually will touch on that a bit in the presentation when we discuss like a case study of how Youngo tends to engage in the UNFCCC spaces. But yeah, I will just say that I appreciate whoever asked that, recognizing the role that young people play and the value that their ambition and fresh perspectives bring to the space. So I'll discuss a little more in depth on how we typically engage and ways that we can enhance that engagement as well. So thanks for the question.
Perfect. Thanks, Jamie. And let's see, next question we can look at. Lots of good ones. Here's a good one. That's broad and can hopefully answer some of the other questions. We wanted to know, what do we think a successful COP28 would look like? Last year, everyone's thoughts were on loss and damage, and obviously this remains an important issue. But in your view, what are the main things negotiators want to get over the line this year?
Again, we'll deal with that in the next few slides, so we can move on. And just to say, don't put your hand up, just put a question in the Q&A. We're not going to do hands up. Do you want to take one more and then we'll answer them in a Word document afterwards?
Yeah. What's the etiquette best practice for approaching government representatives and negotiators or arranging meetings?
I think Jamie and I will have a viewpoint on this. I'll go first. I mean, it depends where you're doing it. So if for example, you're in a negotiating room and you want to talk to one of them, the best time to do it is as they arrive before the negotiation starts, or at the end of the negotiation of that particular session. So don't go and talk to them necessarily if they are already sitting down and basically the debate is going on between the governments. Hit them at the beginning or after. If you've got their telephone number, then you can send them a WhatsApp note saying, can we do a coffee later? So use, when you start to get to know the negotiators, try and get their mobile number so that you can WhatsApp them and say, can we meet for a coffee? Most are pretty happy to do it. I mean, clearly the longer you get into the negotiations, the more stressed they are, because imagine they are probably doing, I don't know, 15 to 20 hour days in the last week, 15 to 20 hour days in the last week. And so if that's the case, that it's more difficult to get them to do things. It's also more difficult to get things in. And again, use single decision countries if you're at the end of it. Jamie, do you have anything?
Yeah, thanks, Felix. Picking up on that last point you mentioned, I would just say that definitely remember that the negotiators are human too, and they are definitely going through a lot of sleepless nights, probably trying to get work done, communicate back to their home country, and figure it all out. So just be respectful of them, and also recognize that a lot of times they kind of have a bottom line that's given to them by their home country, their administration per se. And so even though if they have a perspective, that's like-minded to yours, at the end of the day, they are somewhat bound to what they can and can't do under their home administration. And then the last things I'll say is definitely try to build the relationship up before. So if you can attend bond, if you can even set up like virtual meetings with them ahead of time, it's really great that they recognize your name and they're much less likely to just kind of, blow you off. They don't care what your opinion is. And then the other thing I will say is that be sure that you are coming to them, I guess, on a topic that's relevant at the time. So, don't, even if your agenda is all about the loss and damage fund and they're currently in a negotiation about the global goal on adaptation, don't bring up the loss and damage fund necessarily at the time. I mean, those are kind of linked issues, but you understand what I'm saying. Just be sure that you're educated about when it's appropriate to bring up what topic.
Just an addition, the UK government, the former Director General said of NGOs that they fall into three groups: experts, powerful, and well-intentioned. And so if you're an expert, then governments are interested in what you have to say. If you're powerful, like Greenpeace, WWF, Oxfam, then clearly they have to listen to. But if you're if you're not got something that, as Jamie says, that is really urgent at this particular point, then they're not going to give you the time of day, particularly as it moves through the 2 weeks. Okay, so we move back onto the presentation because I know Jamie has a train to catch.
Yes, let's hop back in. I know we have a lot of questions, so we'll be able to follow up with those later. But without further ado, let's jump back in. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tanner. So, talking about COP28 this year, if you look at what we have on the screen now, this is an overview of what some of the thematic agenda items will, or not agenda items, excuse me, some of the thematic days will be for the 2 weeks. So just to note that sometimes the negotiations don't necessarily correlate with these themes, so that's something to keep in mind. But oftentimes, some of the events happening in pavilions, for example, will be heavily focused on youth, children, and education on December 8th, for example. That is like the Youth and Children Day. So this is determined by COP28 presidency, by the COP28 presidency, and this is kind of the overview of what we have. And then, of course, there are cross-cutting themes that overlie all of these. Those are finance, frontline, grassroots communities, inclusion, and then tech and innovation. Next slide. I'll pass it to Felix.
Yep, thanks very much. Yeah, I would just add that, they're not negotiating. Those days are not those are not negotiations. They are an opportunity to move forward on kind of coalitions of the willing or announcements or things like that. But they may feed in, they're more likely to feed into the outcome document that the COP28 presidency will be producing, because they will have had specific themes that they have identified in those days, which they will then try and draw in something that they feel is advancing the process. So the high level events for the global stock take, they're going to happen on 3 days is at ministerial or heads of state level, depending on which governments send who. With the 1st of December, which will look at adaptation, the 2nd of December, which will look at means of implementation, MOIs, and the 3rd will be a high-level event on mitigation. It's important to know that those are happening, and again, the outputs from that will probably feed into the COP28 presidency's outcome document, like the Sharm implementation plan. It'll be a similar type of document. So look back at what came out of Sharm from the COP27 presidency. You get an idea of what they're doing, and maybe your issue can fit into that better than it can fit into the formal negotiations. Jamie.
Yes, so talking a bit more about the actual kind of layout of COP28. So Expo City is where the negotiations Blue Zone and Green Zone will be hosted. People are really excited about this venue. It's massive, and also it is supposed to be really innovative and have kind of a clean, green, tech, human-centric theme. So I'm really excited to see this. And again, this will be, the Blue Zone is accredited, so you would need to have a badge in advance from an accredited organization. Here's a map of the Blue Zone and the Green Zone, which kind of backs up to it. You can see there's some various stages, thematic arenas, different areas where the pavilions will be hosted as well. You can go to the next slide. And the Blue Zone is a UNFCCC managed site. So when the host country agrees to take on the COP, they essentially sign over the rights of the area to like UN security officers. So those will be who are out and about at the Blue Zone. It is open to the accredited parties and observers, as we've mentioned, 199 parties to the UNFCCC, so that's who's going to be there, as well as accredited observer organizations, which are things like non-governmental, intergovernmental, UN agencies, and of course the media. There are thematic arenas, as you saw on the map, and there will be 4 presentation stages that serve as kind of central gathering points where delegations and attendees can converge to sort of foster dialogue, share insights, and do some knowledge sharing. So each of these stages will host 10 presentations per day. So they'll be quite busy across all 4 stages between December 1st and the 12th. And December 7th, just so you all are aware, is a rest day. So that is a day where there are no negotiations, and it's a day for everyone to catch up right there in the middle of the COP. Okay, next slide. So as I said, everyone who is in the Blue Zone will have a badge, and these are helpful colors to help you know who is who, just on a brief look at someone. Each of their badges are color coded. So the pink badges are parties, so they are a part of a government delegation that is there. Purple are observers of a UN organization. So this could be like UNICEF or UNDRR, for example. They'll have a purple badge. Green are observers of intergovernmental organizations, and yellow are for NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And then orange is going to be media. So there are media from all over the world that cover this COP, and they'll be out and about as well. Speaking of media, press conferences are something that happens every day at the COP. There are press conferences from various parties. There are press conferences from NGOs. There are press conferences from stakeholder groups. And if you're interested in doing a press conference, there are links there on how you can get in touch with the UN press office. And these are also live streamed, so people who are not attending the COP can view them as well. Okay, next slide. And I think I'll pass it back to you, Felix.
Yeah, no, I'm just
Talk about the
dealing
green zone.
with the green zone. So there'll be a number of opportunities to engage in the green zone. We're looking at offering a platform for young youth groups, civil society, NGOs, private sector, indigenous. There's an opportunity for dialogue, but it's also very good for the host country because it means that the local population can engage as well. And so just looking into the green zone in a little bit more depth, again, you'll have this. You can see where the entrances are for the particular things, and in a sense, a little bit of an idea of where they are. And the code indicates, that there's a climate finance hub, there's a technology and innovation hub, there's a startup village, there's a youth hub, there's a greening education hub, there's a voice for action hub. And so that those will be opportunities for engagement for people who don't have a pass, but it also is opportunities for people who have passes. So my experience has been that if you're engaged in the negotiations, it's unlikely that you'll go to the green zone. But if you're engaged in the pavilions in the blue zone, many of them will have, in a sense, compatriot events happening in the green zone. So they'll be organizing across the two zones to have an opportunity to talk to as many people as possible. What to expect? As I just indicated, the energy transition, climate finance technology hub, there'll be curated content, technology conferences, panels, networking, all the kind of things. Arts and culture will be there, and then there's a community engagement. So I was going through those on the diagram, but this is in a sense telling you exactly what the people who are engaging under what themes. So Jamie, it's back to you.
Okay, so why attend in the first place? There's a lot going on, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more, as I said, about Youngo as kind of a case study to understand, and then also just to brief on what can be beneficial about attending the UNFCCC. Of course, first and foremost, many go with the hopes to influence the negotiations, as this is the document that comes out at the end of COP. But of course, there are also press conferences. It's important that the media put pressure on negotiators in various parties. So this is where social media, traditional print media, those can be really critical coming out of the COP. Side events are also great spaces to do knowledge sharing, learn about best practices, and exhibit kind of where the gaps exist for more of civil society space. There are also, as I will touch on in the slide after this, some stakeholder groups that often develop position papers to kind of show the will of civil society as more of a collective and demonstrate the power in numbers. And yeah, it's a great way to get information about what is going on in the negotiation space, to also raise money for some of the work that you are doing potentially, and to build those relationships with other partners who are working in similar spaces around the world. Next slide. Also, just one more point on that I want to raise is that many people say that because of conflict of interest, there's kind of, before there have been boycotts of COP, for example, saying that there is no, they're compromised essentially. But I think it's really important that stakeholders are in the room, because these negotiations are going to happen whether observers are there or they're not. And so much better to have our voices heard than just to cede the space, which will certainly be filled by other kind of invasive interests. So as I said, stakeholder organizations, there are 9 official groups. They all have some kind of fun names: Bingo, Engo, Ringo, Tungo, Youngo, the WGC, LGMA, IPO, and farmers. So these are groups of stakeholders that have been recognized as within the Rio Earth Summit as having an important say in how the negotiations go. So they're all things from business and industry, environmental NGOs, farmers, indigenous people, local governments, research and independence. So this is often where universities fall into the Ringo category, trade unions, women and gender, and then the youth NGO is what I'm going to talk a bit more about. That's Youngo. There are also some kind of informally recognized NGO groups. There are a lot of faith-based organizations that attend these events, parliamentarians, education and communications NGOs. So yeah, those are sort of informally recognized as well. And as I said, what's most common is we see these organizations making joint constituency statements. So oftentimes, for example, Youngo the women and gender constituency and the environmental NGOs will often align and show kind of a broader spectrum of where civil society is pushing the negotiations. And next slide, I'll pass to Felix. You're muted, Felix.
What I was just going to add is that individual organizations cannot speak in the negotiations. You have to do it through one of the 9 Rio constituencies. And so if you have an interest in putting your viewpoint, you have to persuade that constituency that that's the right perspective. The research and the research group doesn't take a position, so it is a little bit more flexible. So Arizona could speak, or kind of UNC, but we would be doing it with the permission of the constituency. So, you know, there are gatekeepers to those, and that's because, you know, with 40 to 70,000 people, you can't operate, and you only have 1 or 2 opportunities in a negotiated room to speak, and probably only 2 or 3 of you would do it. Hence the chances where you can get it, if you can have women, youth, and NGOs perhaps speaking together. So I was just going to very quickly go through I set up and ran with the Stockholm International Water Institute, the Water and Climate Coalition. It was established in 2007 at the Stockholm Water Week. It was a multi-stakeholder coalition, and at this particular point, not one text from the UNFCCC mentioned water. So we thought that was a missing component, both in adaptation and mitigation. We went to this 2008 Polish UNFCCC to understand the process and who was there. And then in 2009, we started at the Bonn preparatory meeting doing side events. We set up a Friends of Climate and Water with the member states. We tried to accredit through member states a Dutch government official and a German government official to speak at our side event, and their climate negotiators said water has nothing to do with climate change, so they couldn't come as a government delegate. So we had to accredit them as an NGO. Well, that became embarrassing, and so they in the end actually allowed them in. And we had a situation where we were producing a daily newsletter of 10 to 12 pages, similar to what you see with ECO, but slightly larger, which we fronted with the issues of water, but we raised other things. And in fact, Richard Sherman, who you saw for the chair of the transitional committee, was for 2 of these our political editor, and he was giving us the analysis of exactly where the negotiations were as far as G77. He was on the South African government delegation, and therefore the newspaper was seen, or the magazine was seen, as very influential. So we came in with a big team. I used to sit, we used to have the meetings in Bonn in the Maritime. You couldn't get past me into the negotiations because of the way the hotel was done. So, you know, it was very easy to pick off the negotiators, and the Maritime didn't have many plug holes for you to do your charging of your computer. So I took along with me a extension lead with a lot of plug holes. And so if you wanted to use one of those plug holes to power up your laptop or your phone, then you had to have the pitch on why water should be in the agreement. So we had water in Copenhagen, but of course the whole thing fell apart, and we'd fought initially on adaptation, and we were being accused of being more a sector interest. And then when we came back in 2010, we came in on both adaptation and mitigation, and we got what we wanted, which was the setting up of workshops to bring water and climate into the national adaptation plans. So you can see it didn't happen quickly, but then once we'd engaged properly, we were able to move things pretty quickly. But it is then being absolutely on top of who the negotiators are and being prepared to be in the negotiations from, at that time, 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning until 7 or 8 in the evening, so that you can pick everybody off, or that you had someone going to the room to pick them off. So that's just a small example. I think it's back to you, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a great case example, specifically with like the water theme and policy. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how Youngo engages. So as I mentioned, Youngo is one of the 9 stakeholder groups with the youth and children constituency. So you can be a part of Youngo as an individual or as an organization, as long as it's headed by youth and young people. So here, this is an image of not all, but some of the Youngo participants at the Bonn meeting in Germany. So you can see that, yeah, there's a great presence there and a lot of work that goes into it. So next slide. I'm going to talk about a few ways of advocacy and kind of engagement in the UNFCCC space. So the first 2 I've already mentioned, one being press and communications. So just shameless plug, I am in the communications working group of Youngo. So a lot of the work we do is highlighting different demands coming from youth and trying to communicate those to press to get out to the broader audience, and as well as youth and children who are following along with the negotiations and beyond outside of COP online. And then the second one is intervention. So you can see in this image, someone is speaking on behalf of youth NGOs or Youngo here in this photo. And this is where in a formal, or I guess technically they're called informal negotiations, all the parties are present in the room. So this is a really direct way that youth can get their voice heard and other constituencies in the negotiations. Okay, next slide. Some other engagement that we do at Youngo and other constituency bodies, every morning there is something called a daily spokes council. Other constituencies probably call it other things, but it's essentially a meeting to review what's coming up on the agenda today, where are the negotiations, where do we want them to go, and how can we kind of influence that. So it's a lot of information sharing. I mentioned the communications as well. And direct interventions, also bilateral meetings. So these are meetings that Youngo has worked to set up in advance with either other constituencies. So for example, we might meet with the women gender constituency and hear their thoughts and share ours. It might be with a party. So for example, we've met with the United States before and heard where their negotiating minds are and shared kind of our priorities. It also might be with the UN agencies. So for example, we work pretty closely with UNICEF. Of course, they deal with youth and children a lot. Also working with the UNFCCC Secretariat directly. So as Felix mentioned, Simon Steele, who is the executive secretary currently, is a great friend of ours, and we try to meet with him regularly, because the UNFCCC Secretariat does have some pull in kind of how negotiations are shaped, and they write a host country agreement, for example, with the host country. We also do a lot of capacity building. So this is engaging beyond the COP space, holding information sessions like this, teaching young people what the main issues are and how to engage in them effectively at the negotiations. We also sponsor delegates to go. So Youngo doesn't have any funding directly, but organizations within Youngo provide funding so that youth from around the world are able to attend, get a flight, accommodation, etc. There are also something called LCOI, RCOI, and GCOIs. This stands for Local Conference of Youth, Regional Conference of Youth, and Global Conference of Youth. So these happen all over the world, locally at the national level as well as regionally. And this is kind of like a pre-COP meeting where young people come together, they create lists of demands, and then in the end, at the G COI, which is COI 18 this year, they're numbered just as the COPs are, and this will be number 18. There will be a global youth statement is launched, and this is kind of encapsulating all of the demands from youth around the world. There are also actions on the ground. These are more traditional, like protests, for example, and these do have to be approved and advanced by the UNFCCC. So it's a really safe space, but also a space for free speech and action as well. And then we have our own pavilion, the Children and Youth Pavilion, where we host various events and do information sharing. And then funding, of course, is a big deal at the COP. We always are trying to increase our funding because most youth and children are in school or, you know, working at home or something. They don't have a formal job that allows them to attend these events. So someone mentioned, you know, how can we be more engaged? One way is definitely funding, and then also just highlighting all of these other initiatives. And these are year-long working groups. We have working groups on all the key themes, mitigation, adaptation, etc. And they meet around the clock all year. It's really amazing, virtually, in order to prepare and be ready for these negotiations when the time comes. Pass it.
Yep, thanks very much, Jamie. So just to kind of give you an idea of an overview of how to approach the COP, you know what you want from the COP. And that can be best practice presentations, but it can be know that you want to try and influence the text. You know what the agenda being discussed, as Jamie said. You know, don't go and talk to a government about something that's not relevant to that particular government official who is there. You have to be very clear about what you're asking, and it is on the agenda. Too often people outside don't appreciate what the agenda really is. It's not often what they think it is. So it's definitely worth checking on the UNFCCC site where they are with particular negotiations. Know what your the decision-making process in your country. So we're now very close to it, but basically you should have been meeting your government's representatives in capital in the period up to Bonn, and then after Bonn leading up to Dubai, so that you know what their decision process, if they're in a group. So if it's France, then they'll have an individual position, which they'll then take into the negotiations with the EU. So know what the process is. Know when to work at which level. So know when to work with your government or with the group. So if it's the EU, then make sure you're having meetings with the European Union as a group of NGOs or stakeholders in advance of before they take their position. Know when the decisions are taken. So again, many of the initial, not decisions, but the framing of the decisions are taken in Bonn. And so therefore that's where you know what tools you can use, who you've built a relationship with, which governments, which other stakeholder groups will support you. The larger the group of stakeholders through the 9 major groups that are supporting a position, the more likely the governments are going to take a position on it. Know when to make your position. Again, earlier the better that you can do that. Know the government officials. I often, when I was in the UK, I would go out for coffee or lunch or dinner with the negotiators, but I wouldn't go and meet them in their office because it's then more of a formal thing. And if you can build that informal relationship, you're more likely to hear more about what the position is. Know who the UN officials are. I mean, Jamie was talking about the relationship with the head of the UNFCCC. There are lots of great people working for the UNFCCC who are trying to support a more of a progressive outcome than perhaps the governments are at that particular time trying to get. So they can be helpful, and they can also tell you where some of the blocks are. So if there's a block in a particular negotiation, if you've built the relationship up, they may be able to tell you where that is and what you can do to perhaps help that. I mean, I've been in 3 a.m. in the negotiation on agriculture, where the chair of the negotiation, this is not the UNFCCC, it was in New York, has turned to me and 2 other people, because we were the only NGOs left at 3 a.m. in the morning, going, do you have any suggestions? And so we made actually the suggestion that sorted out the problem that was being addressed. So if you've built that relationship, it has an impact. Know who is on your side, but know who your problems are. And if you can convert the problem country from being a problem country to being basically not active on the issue, that's unlikely that you'll move it from being against to in favor. But if you're at this stage of the process, just get them so that they won't take a position. I got a particular government to go to the toilet when the decision was being taken, because if they'd been in the room, they would have had to vote against it. So that relationship can have big impacts. So Jamie, it's back to you.
Yeah, sure. So we mentioned side events earlier, but just to review, These are events that are happening alongside of the negotiations, but they are run by the UNFCCC. So these are approved events that can be found on the online site. There's already an agenda up, and we'll make sure the link is there as well. The themes for this year's event were migration, adaptation, means to implementation, holistic approaches, and other topics related to the UNFCCC process, especially this year, the global stocktake. So oftentimes countries or NGOs and different intergovernmental organizations will submit proposals for events. You know, we have this initiative that we want to highlight, or we noticed this gap. And then those are submitted. Typically, they have to merge with other organizations who have similar themes because there are so many submissions. And then those are going on side along of the negotiations and can be great opportunities for learning as well. Next slide.
I think it's back to me. So
Yeah.
the 5 priorities that were set for the presidency were mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance, and the fifth more controversial one was innovating the process through private sector engagement, inclusion, accountability, and transparency. Looking at I think someone had asked what would the outcome be. So these are the 5 areas that we kind of we think might be the areas for particular outcomes. There are lots of individual negotiations going on that will have individual things, but this is the broad position. We're going to look at global stocktake and NDCs, the climate finance. We'll look at the global adaptation goal, loss and damage, and what's known as the coalition of the willing. So on the global stocktake, we talked about the process before, and it takes every 5 years. What we've seen is that the latest figures from the UNFCCC that came out, I think today, show that we're not on line to deliver what we had expected to do, but we have moved the needle. You know, it was on a 4 to 6 degree increase prior to Paris. After Paris, it came down. After Glasgow, it came down. Now, you have to assume that these figures, which I'm using from the carbon tracker, I haven't had an opportunity to update since today's announcement from the UNFCCC, which says that there were only 20 new or updated NDCs submitted before September 23. So I will have to update this after the COP to include those. That, yeah, we have basically 75 parties to the Paris Agreement that account for 87% of the world's GDP and 77% of the greenhouse gases. So it's a particular position. And at the moment, the latest for NDCs are implemented. Current commitments will increase emissions by about 8.8% compared to 2010 levels. So this isn't good news, but we are hopefully that on a downwards trend, because if you do it compared to 2019 levels, then we will actually be peaking by 2030. So depends which year you take, but it's I guess another wake-up call prior to the COP. Wait a second. What we found was that from if we were emission target for 2030 from 2021, which is the last figure I had, we needed to have emissions to fall by 45%, and they were then expected to increase by 14% according to the IPCC. At least 90% of the coal reserves and 60% of the oil and gas reserves must stay underground if we're going to achieve that. The 100 billion was meant to be a floor, not a ceiling, and it was meant to be reached by this COP. It hasn't. I think it's about 96 billion. The conversation will be now on what we have to do post that. What will be the new, what they call collective quantifiable goal on climate finance. And so the process started in Glasgow to start to define what that new target will be. It will be decided in COP29. There's been a set of technical expert dialogues since the Glasgow COP. There'll be a stock take just before the COP starts, and then there'll be a ministerial dialogue about it on Sunday, the 3rd of December. What you have there are the two co-chairs, Fiona from Australia and Zahir again from South Africa. South Africa played a critical role, as you can see through all the negotiations. Zahir has been the lead negotiator on finance for the G77 and has chaired the Green Climate Fund, and is, I think, one of the star people who've been engaged. The issue will be for the process of, as we move forward, is this going to just be public sector money, or will it have to include private sector money? And if you think that I think the present ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, is around 250 billion. The chances are that the target that you'd be needing to come up with and agree would be something like $1 trillion. And that trillion wouldn't be $1 trillion just by itself. It will be $1 trillion to perhaps ensure that you get more like 5 trillion, a bit like the Global Environment Facility. It generates extra money to be able to address climate change. Adaptation funding. This is, you've got 3 different funds. Once we get the loss and damage, you've got the Green Climate Fund, you've got the loss and damage fund, hopefully, and then the adaptation funding. Glasgow made a lot of commitments for 40 billion annually on this. We've not increased that by that much. The hope was that we would perhaps get around 130 billion by 2030 on adaptation funding. There's been some work in Africa to kind of identify what adaptation funding would mean there. The question is also, do you bring in the commercial banks on this? So there's a whole lot of open-ended questions on adaptation funding. Also, the global goal on adaptation. This is a process leading into COP 29. The outcome is hoped for this, the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh Glass work program, is to start to define what they mean by the global goals. So are they going to go down the same road as the Sustainable Development Goals? So they would have a goal, a set of targets, and some indicators. And there have been 7 meetings looking at this so far, and they'll be looking to make a decision on whether or not to follow down the same approach as was done for the SDGs. If they do, I think they need to include means of implementation as an additional part of that. So loss and damage fund, I think, Jamie, it's back to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Felix. And I know that you said I would wish that I would have all the solutions to this, but unfortunately I do not. It's very complicated. But as we mentioned, there is a transitional committee that has been meeting at this point. I believe they have met 5 times. And really some of the key things that we're trying to see what will come out of COP28 are where's the fund going to be hosted. So the transitional committee has produced a set of recommendations and determined that for an interim period of 4 years, it will be hosted at the World Bank. Other questions include, will this be a standalone fund or incorporated elsewhere? The extent of the bureaucracy behind the fund and kind of the support needed to run the fund. There are fears that the money will go more towards the bureaucracy and running the fund than to the actual people, vulnerable communities that need the money the most now.
a question of who will pay into the fund and who will be eligible to receive money out of the fund in the cases of losses and damages. The scope of the fund, is it going to be grants based? Is it going to be loans? For example, there's a lot of push for it to be grants based only, in order to not have to pay back. And this kind of all goes back to the historical responsibility that Felix touched on earlier. And how is the loss and damage fund situated in relations to the GCF and the adaptation fund? As Felix mentioned, those are the kind of the two other main funds that are discussed in the UNFCCC space. Another question is, how is this going to kind of address the issue of fossil fuel phase out? And picking up on the idea of a renewable energy goal and allocated technologies, such as carbon capture and storage, which is controversial in some spaces as kind of a false solution. So yeah, just interested to see where this all develops. And as I said, the Transitional Committee has produced recommendations, and there is a sort of consensus right now going into the COP, but it's up to the parties ultimately to make the decision. And I'll pass it back to Felix.
Yeah, I mean,
on
just
Article
going to say a
6.
little bit on Article 6 on the carbon markets. I'm not going to go into depth. There's some notes that you'll get with this, but you know, ultimately it's about how do we create a viable carbon market that we can trust. And we've seen a lot of articles recently in the paper about carbon offsets that give us no hope that the system is at the moment robust enough. And so this will be a really important thing, whether or not we can create a guardrail for all the international carbon markets, and whether the registry will be able to be transparent and accountable, and how often will we do reporting against what has been committed and how much is falling in the commercial side of the process. So just this is left over from Glasgow, which did a lot of the work in moving it forward. But at this particular point, I think people are very worried that just growing trees isn't the answer, particularly if you're not looking after them in a proper way. I saw one project which was dropping tree planting or seeds from a drone. Well, how can you verify if that actually ever grew or was looked after or whatever? So I think we have to be very much more stringent on what actually is supported. So beyond the negotiations, the coalitions of the willing, there were a number of coalitions launched in Glasgow, and then there have been a number that Jamie mentioned in the context of Sharm. The reason why these are important is that you can't get the decision in the COP. Then if you can get the countries that want to move something forward, then get them to do that, because then they get to a point where they've established credibility, particularly on the methane pledge, for example. If they can show that they have cut methane, then maybe you can move into the negotiations a commitment. So these are a way to move the process forward and not wait for the negotiations. So in for the breakthroughs, we've seen them in a number of sectors. And so Jamie, I think, mentioned the cement and concrete, but there's also initiatives around aluminium, aviation, green hydrogen, metals and minerals, kind of buses, heavy goods vehicles, fashion. So all of these areas need to maybe they need to have a proper accountability mechanism. Otherwise, we can't believe them. And so some of them have and some of them don't. One of the big things that came out of Glasgow was a coalition that dealt with the finance sector, where, and you'll have this to look at, a number of asset managers, asset owners, banks and insurers made commitments. Some of them that were meant to be done by 2030, and some meant to have basically started to report already. Some of this has caused problems because, for example, in the United States, where a number of the companies that are asset managers were moving away from fossil fuels to to renewables. A number of state assemblies that are under Republican control have been threatening to challenge that they can do that, and so there's a whole conversation going on in relation to what can they do, and so this is a very important thing, because if you can get the banks, the insurers, and the asset owners to move forward, then you're going to make a huge difference. Race to zero, Jamie.
Yeah, so in a similar line, the Race to Zero is a big coalition of various non-state actors, including companies, financial institutions, cities, states and regions, and educational institutions. You can go to the next slide, Felix. So the idea is that this is a way to rally leadership and support from these various entities who are interested in moving towards a net zero future. And it also helps create jobs and unlocks some inclusive and sustainable growth. So this has been a mobilization effort amongst people working outside of the parties per se. And these are really like real economy actors who are there to join this large alliance working to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. Next slide. So we're wrapping up here and just want to recall some of the main issues that we discussed that are going to be occurring at COP28 and you want to keep an eye out for. The first is the global stock take and increased NDCs. So looking for a growth in that 100 billion, for example, that's below this new target that's looking more in the trillions, as Felix mentioned. Accountability mechanisms for coalitions of the willing. So of course, there are these coalitions who say that they're interested and want to sign on, but ensuring that they are then actually following through without it being written into the final agreement. Global goal on adaptation will be important. Of course, the outcome of the loss and damage fund will be critical. Fossil fuels and incorporating language beyond coal will be important as well. And new rules for the global carbon market, this is Article 6, will be critical at the same time. And next slide. A couple other things to keep in mind. These are important dates. So of course, we're discussing the COP, which is coming up in the next couple of weeks, but there are negotiations and various conversations that happen throughout the year where it's a lot of prep for this COP and also external conversations and decisions that play a big role. So these are some important dates to have in mind. And if you are a part of an organization that's really hoping to get some text into the negotiation space, then these are critical to attend to. A couple of those would just be like the United Nations Environment Assembly has meetings, the high-level political forum will have a couple of ministerial meetings, as well as their main forum on discussing the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those goals to be discussed is SDG 13 on climate action, along with some others. And then, of course, always looking ahead to the preparatory meeting in Bonn that will occur again in June every year. And then the UNFCCC COP29, our next COP in the next November. Okay, and I'll pass it to Felix to wrap up.
Yeah, just a couple of extra links that may be useful to you, so that you can get that. Again, you'll get that in the PowerPoint. If you want to engage with me, you'll have this information of where you can follow my blog. You can write for my blog if you want to write an article. I have guest articles on the blog. But if you want to go to Spotify, you'll find a Sustainable Society Cafe, which we've set up, which is mostly looking at the tomorrow's people and new technology, but which looks at 2030 and looks at your home and looks at travel and health and education, and then looks at the SDGs and the Paris Agreement in the context of that. So it might be of interest to you. So I think passing back to you, Jamie, for the final one.
Yeah, thanks. So there's my contact as well and my LinkedIn, especially if you have young people in your life or in your organization, or you're a young person yourself attending this. Would love to get you plugged into the Youngo space. I also have linked our social media. Please follow us and give it some love. And the mailing list, which is important to get some updates, as well as the COI information. And that'll have a link to the Global Youth Statement, which, as I said, is kind of a collaborative approach to youth demands from around the globe. And then some more information about our pavilion. And I'll be in Dubai for both weeks, so I'd love to connect with many of you there. And yeah, thanks for attending, and really excited for Dubai. Looking forward to it. Back to you, Tanner.
Yeah, and Jamie, if you want to go off for your train, I can take some questions at the end. It's up to you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I have to catch a train. I'm actually in Geneva for a conference right now and getting back to the States. So lovely to see you all, and thanks again for your attendance. Thanks, Felix and Tanner, for organizing. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Tanner, do you want to come back? Thank you very much, Jamie. Do you want to come back and maybe take 5 or 10 minutes? We're not doing hands up. We're doing questions in the Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. So reminder to put any questions you have in the Q&A, and thanks to those who have already done that. So let me scroll up to some of the earlier questions. Well, a big question I've seen from a lot of people in a few different forms, we alluded to it a little bit, but people are wondering how they can participate virtually, or if certain aspects of COP is going to be live streamed.
So yes, if you go to the UNFCCC website, you'll see there's a YouTube channel, and I think I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm pretty sure that all of the thematical days plenaries will be live streamed. So I think if you go back when you get it to the different days that have been assigned by the presidency, you'll be able to go on to YouTube through the UNFCCC portal, and that'll tell you where to go. And once you've gone to the YouTube channel, you just bookmark it, so because that's where they'll all go. As far as the negotiations, I'm guessing that maybe clearly the heads of state meetings at the beginning, so there's a couple of days of heads of state statements, that'll all be broadcast. Many of the pavilions will be live broadcasts. So ASU has a pavilion. We've signed a contract for ASU's YouTube and for our LinkedIn to live broadcast. I'm imagining that lots of the pavilions will do that. Now, where do you go to get that information? That's a good question. The COP28 presidency have set up a system, I think, where we can register all of the individual events. But I think what is really needed is, in a sense, a pavilion page which would list all the pavilions, and then you click there and it takes you to the pavilion's own agenda for the day or for the whole time period. So I think that bit of it's a little bit unsure, but we're doing, I think we're starting on the 30th in the afternoon, for example, at ASU, and we're finishing on the 10th. We'll have 3 events a day, and those will all be kind of promoted, and we'll send you a link to that once we've got that up. It'll be very close to the COP, but just so if you're interested, you can follow some of the issues that ASU is engaged in or is really interested in promoting. Tanner?
So another question we had a bit earlier was how you see the role of transitional committees in terms, it's either transitional or transnational committees, in terms of influencing the negotiations of COP28 specifically. Furthermore, what are your insights on the influence of pavilions? First time established like Faith Pavilion and SDGs Pavilion in COP28.
Yeah, so the transitional committee will be part of the negotiations, and so they will have a negotiation on establishing a loss and damage fund. And so whatever has come out of that, as Jamie indicated, will be the starting point for the negotiations, and they will either accept some of the recommendations from that or negotiate it. I can't imagine that it won't go until towards the end of the last day before they finalize what they're going to do. They made a decision to take existing text from the Green Climate Fund and establish it, because it was all already agreed language. So they thought it would be easier. But as Jamie said, the worrying problem of that is that it creates a top-heavy bureaucracy. And so we'll have to see what happens during the negotiations. On the pavilions, you know, the negotiators probably aren't going to come to the pavilions. They may have people on the delegation that they will send to pavilions. There may be people who on each delegation you've invited to speak. I think the question is, what is the purpose of the pavilion? And it goes back to one of Jamie's previous slides. If it's to show best practice or to show ideas, you have to decide what it's trying to do. If it's to get an issue back on the agenda or get an issue on the agenda, then that's important. So, for example, the water pavilion, it's trying to get water back onto the agenda. It's the second iteration of the Water and Climate Coalition, but they'll also be engaged in a number of the negotiations, perhaps the national the adaptation or mitigation plans, to try and get something in there on water. So it's a way of highlighting stuff, but a lot of it is about good practice which people can take back with them. A lot of them is about the opportunity to share particular issues, and then to strategize on how to move it forward. In the context of ASU, we have some, I think, 10 things that we're interested in the UNFCCC addressing, some of which are in the negotiations, some of which we'll be highlighting for future negotiations. So it's a bit of a mix. They're not going to impact on the negotiations that are happening now. If you're thinking of the pavilion to influence something, it's influencing it for future years.
Is there any expert group, formal or informal, that you know of, Felix, on AI and climate action?
I don't know. I think AI may come into the future, the Summit of the Futures. I'm not following that, but that might be a place where it's done. There's no negotiations going on. There may be something established in coming years on that, but you'd have to, you know, we already have too many negotiations and too many expert groups. So first we need to pull the system into a more manageable state. And then the question is, if I was looking for doing something on that, I'd be looking for something in the outcome document that the presidency is calling for a set of dialogues in Bonn, or a dialogue in Bonn on AI and climate change. That will be my advice.
Do you have any advice on how to organize your day at COP?
My day or anyone's day, I guess that's a different thing. So this year I'm going to have a lot of commitment in the first ever ASU pavilion. So my days will be much more that way. I would be, depending which of those 9 constituency or stakeholder groups that you feel aligns with you, you should go and sign up for their information, their WhatsApp, attend their morning meetings. They're usually morning meetings, so that you get up to date on what's happening, and perhaps find other people working on the same issues as you, so that you can work together on those issues. But you know, if you're going to the COP as a way of kind of finding out some of the best ideas or things, go through the side event schedule, go through the pavilions once we have them, build up a set of things which address the issue you're interested in. So if you want to do water, for example, how is that being addressed by either the presidency's thematical days? So there are things to go there. How many water events? And you do a search on the UNFCCC, has all of the side events on water, see where it's being addressed, and then look at, water won't just be dealt with by the water pavilion, it'll be dealt with by the resilience pavilion, by the SDG pavilion. So depending on the issue you want to do, you can build up an opportunity to make lots of good contacts, but also to work and find out what's actually going on that issue of yours.
Another logistical question. Am I correct that if for the fire safety or other reasons, the limit has been reached in the blue zone, anyone with a badge may have to wait for entry?
So that's not an unusual situation. So, I mean, I was engaged in the Johannesburg summit, helping South Africa a little bit on that. And if the venue reached its capacity, then they will stop people going in and until people go out. So that's a normal thing and will apply to any conference that the UN holds.
Do we expect for there to be any large climate marches, as has been the case in other COPs? And if
Well,
so, how do you find out about
so
that?
so I don't know the answer to that. I would go to the Climate Action Network and see whether they're planning it. There was a problem in Sharm because of where they placed the kind of demonstration for people who wanted to demonstrate. We were in the middle of nowhere, so it kind of didn't make much sense. And so the UNFCCC and the Egyptian government allowed for there to be additional spaces for demonstrations and walks in the venue. So that was negotiated with security. So again, in the links that Jamie talked about, if you want to organize something, go to security. If they're sensible, usually security is very happy to do it. And I have to say, when I chaired the NGO coalition at the UN, UN security were my best friends, because I was often getting NGOs out of trouble who had done things that they hadn't thought through before they did it. So do always ask. And the UNFCCC Secretariat have an stakeholder office as well, that they're also very happy to facilitate, but where all of the constituencies will know how to do this. So again, if you're an NGO, go through the NGO environmental NGOs, and they'll have details about. No hands up. If someone's putting a hand up, you have to do it through the Q&A.
Can you please clarify the definition of advocacy and non-advocacy actions by NGOs at COP?
Well, I mean, it's more broader than that. So you have well, it's not just NGOs, it's all of the constituencies. So it's all the stakeholders are trying to advance either policy positions that they think will enable the 1.5 degree target to be reached quicker, or they'll be advancing sets of texts that they think will help address some of the subsidiary items. And so the reality is, let's say that there was 40,000 in Sharm. I would say probably no more than 250 to 500 were actually engaged in the negotiations. We're trying to meet government delegates. So the amount of people, often, particularly people who have never lobbied before, will work through the constituency bodies, so that the constituencies who have a historical understanding of the issue and have people who can lobby because they've done it before. If you want to learn to lobby, you need to go, I think, to the Bonn meeting. This is not an easy one for you to turn up and say, hey, I'm A, B, and C, and they're going, well, why weren't you here in Bonn? Or, I haven't got time to speak to you. The non-advocacy ones are, often the implementers, the people, the NGOs that are active in taking those things. So you have some which are both. So people like Oxfam or Christian Aid or Save the Children Fund, they're both advocates in the process, based on what they've learned on in the ground in the communities. And then there'll also be people who will be trying to advance good climate policy in the with their partners in developing countries to make it more resilient to the changes that are coming.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I'll combine another logistical question with 2 of the questions. So are there any channels left for accessing badges to COP for this year? And then could you share, if you know, where to find the pavilion schedules, where those are available?
So the pavilion schedules are not available at the moment. I will be nudging the Secretariat and also the COP28 presidency to put that up. For Glasgow, I noticed in the first week that they weren't up, and I lobbied very strongly for it to be put up, and it was put up for the second week. For Sharm, I lobbied before the event, and so it was up for the event, and so you could go to a pavilion page which listed where, you know, click to all of the pavilions. I'll talk to my people, the people I know in the UAE, to see if what they're thinking. I have a sneaking suspicion that the thing that we had out, where they are basically creating a combined diary of all events, is where they've gone, and I think that's, though useful, it's not actually as useful as having both. So I think we need a pavilion list and links to their websites, and we need also the bigger list, which has everyone in who's doing an event at any of the pavilions, so that you can look daily on what you want to go. What was the other question? Oh yeah, badges. So the only way you can get badges now is through organizations that already are going, but maybe one of their speakers has fallen out, or they haven't fulfilled all their days. So one of the changes that happened this year, which has opened up possibilities for more people, is that in the past you had to with the UNFCCC, you had to register people for week 1 or week 2 or both weeks. What they've done this time, for the first time I think ever, is they've assigned it on a daily basis. So if you're going for all the 10 days or whatever, then there's a click next to you. But then if you're only going for 2 days, so then you click 2 days, that means the organization has a number of extra days that week that they can assign to people. But, you know, it's not going to be that you will get in for the whole time, but the only way of finding that is contacting constituency bodies or contacting NGOs that you know have accreditation, and see if they have any spare days.
I think one final question is one of them I saw was, when is the next briefing? Maybe a good way to answer this is, how do we stay in touch, and how do we stay in the loop about future workshops and other events?
So we will maybe send you 2 things from this. The first thing will be in 7 days you'll get the video, missing the beginning bit because we forgot to turn on recording, but I think we were just doing introductions at that time, and you'll have the PDF of the presentation, plus we'll go back through all the Q&A and see if we can find any other questions that haven't been answered that we can answer. So you'll go to a Google Drive where these will be available. We'll also send you if we get confirmation of them doing the pavilion list, we'll send you all of you a link to where that is, and we'll also include in that of course where the ASU pavilion is, and if we do future briefings, then we'll let you know. We're not planning to do another one for this COP. What we tend to do is one before the Bonn meeting and one about this time, and as you've attended this, hopefully you're feeling really happy. I do for organizations proper lobbying, 3-day lobbying workshops, but those aren't open. They're kind of there for organizations who take me on to help their staff engage in the process. But once we've got the material out to you, please do share it with colleagues. The more of people who understand a little bit of it, and the great thing with this is you can go back and look at stuff, and you don't have to know all of this. Just focus, as I said, on what you particularly want to follow, and then look at the arc of that, whether that's through side events, whether it's through pavilions, or whether it's through the negotiations. Otherwise, you know, I think you can get lost because there's so much going on.
Perfect. So apologies, we weren't able to answer all your questions, but we did take note of all of them in the Q&A. We will also download the chat, so we'll have all your emails and any other information you put in there. But I think that concludes the workshop today. Felix, any last words before we sign off?
I think just Yeah, I mean, I'll be at the Arizona Pavilion, so if you ever get a question that you want answered and you want to buy me a coffee or something, I'm always good for a coffee and a chat. Come and find me. We're going to stay on because we're going to just deal with some of the logistics, but as far as I'm concerned, it's closed, and thank you very much for coming.